Stan Cribb was driving a hearse through the East End. It was a job that required dignity, slow movement, and precision. But on the afternoon of December 5th, 1952, Stan wasn't worried about dignity. He was worried about the road. He watched through the windscreen as the world dissolved. First, the street lamps vanished, then the curb. Finally, the bonnet of his own vehicle disappeared into a thick, swirling grey wall. Stan was sitting in driver's seat, gripping the wheel, blind in the middle of London. He didn't know it yet, but he was driving through the opening hours of the deadliest environmental disaster in British history. To understand how a city of 8 million people could be suffocated in its own home, we have to look at the ground beneath their feet. London sits in a bowl. It is a low-lying basin framed by the chalk hills of the North Downs and Chilterns. For centuries, this geography acted as a trap for natural mist. But by 1952, the mist was no longer natural. It was a chemical suspension. The British people had a romantic name for it: pea-souper. It was the backdrop of Charles Dickens and Sherlock Holmes, a quirky characteristic of the capital. It was viewed as nuisance, something to be endured with a stiff upper lip. But this complacency was dangerous. The fog of 1952 was different because the city was different. 7 years after the Second World War, Britain was still a nation on its knees. The Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was back in power, but he was leading a country broken by debt. The treasury was empty, and the government was desperate for cash. The solution lay in the ground: coal. Churchill's government, driven by the Minister of Fuel and Power, Geoffrey Lloyd, made a calculated economic decision. Britain possessed high quality, hard coal, clean burning anthracite. But this black gold was too valuable to burn at home. It was exported to Europe and the Americans to pay off war debts. What remained for the people of London was a low grade, dusty residue known as nutty slag. It was cheap, it was plentiful, and it was filthy. Geoffrey Lloyd's ministry championed it as a patriotic fuel, but nutty slag burned poorly. It forced families to burn more of it to stay warm, pumping clouds of sulfur and fly ash out of million domestic chimneys. Churchill and Lloyd were focused on the Cold War and the economy. They saw smoke as a sign of industry, of a city back at work. They didn't see it as a weapon.
The high-pressure front is advancing across the south of the country and now holds steady directly above London, promising clear skies for the coming days.
The trap was set on Thursday. December 4th, an anticyclone, a massive high pressure system, drifted over southern England and stalled. The wind died completely. The air went still. As night fell, the ground cooled rapidly, chilling the air near the pavement. But above the rooftops, a layer of warmer air settled like a blanket. Meteorologists called it a temperature inversion. The smoke rising from the chimneys hit that warm ceiling and couldn't escape. It was forced back down. The city was now a sealed room, and the exhaust pipe was venting inside. Friday dawned cold and bright, but as the temperature dropped below freezing, the fires were stopped in homes from Ealing to West Ham. By early afternoon, the change began. The fog didn't roll in, it thickened from within. It changed color, witnesses describing it shifting from white to a bruised yellow and finally to a sulphurous brown. It wasn't just a loss of visibility, it was a sensory assault. The air smelled of rotten eggs and coal tar. It tasted metallic. Josie Glosius, a 16-year-old typist, walked home to East London that evening. When she walked through her front door, she looked at her skirt. There was a dark, greasy rim around the hem, where the air had physically stained the fabric. This wasn't just smoke, the humidity was reacting with the sulfur dioxide to form sulfuric acid. Londoners were walking through a suspended ocean of acid. By Saturday, the paralysis was total. London Transport cancelled the bus services. The iconic red double deckers were abandoned in depots. In the few places they tried to run, conductors had to walk in front of the buses holding the flares, guiding the drivers inch by inch. The smog didn't respect doors or windows. At Sadler's Well Theatre, a performance of Verdi's La Traviata was underway. During the first act, the smog crept into the auditorium. The audience in the dress circle lost sight of the stage. The singers, their throat burning from the acid air, began to choke. The opera was abandoned at the interval. But the first sign that this was a killing event didn't come from a hospital. It came from a cattle show. At Earl's Court, prize cattle began to wheeze. Their tongues turned blue. They collapsed at their stalls, suffocating. Veterinarians were called in to euthanize 12 of them. The newspapers reported the death of the cows. They didn't yet know about the people. Sunday marked the peak of the toxicity. This was the day of the quiet death. Unlike the bits where death came with the scream of sirens, the smog killed in the silence. Inside the row houses, the elderly and the sick sat in their armchairs, gasping for air. The acid mist triggered massive inflammation in the lungs. Airways constricted. The heart, straining to pump thick, deoxygenated blood, simply gave out. People didn't fall in the streets, they died in their beds. Inside the hospitals, the system was collapsing. The emergency bed service was overwhelmed. Admissions for respiratory issues spiked by 163%. At the Royal London Hospital, patients were wheeled in with lips blue from sinuses. The smog was so thick inside the wards that nurses couldn't see from one end of the room to the other. By Monday, the collapse of the hospitals gave way to the collapse of the morgues. The alarm was raised by the undertakers. Stan Cribb, the man who had been driving the hearse on Friday, ran out of coffins. Florists across London ran out of flowers. The sheer volume of the dead created a logistical bottleneck that the city had never seen in peacetime. Outside, the surreal nightmare continued. People reported birds falling from the sky, starlings and sparrows, disoriented and poisoned, crashing into buildings or dropping dead onto the pavement. Stories emerged of the walkers, people who had simply walked off the edge of the embankment into the Thames and drowned, unable to distinguish the river from the road. The boundaries of the world had dissolved. While the mocks filled, the government remained paralyzed. In Downing Street, Winston Churchill was dismissive. To him, fog was a natural weather event, not a political crisis. He was focused on foreign affairs, on the empire. He reportedly quipped that the fog would clear, and so would the panic. His Minister of Fuel, Geoffrey Lloyd, was equally defensive. To admit the coal was killing people would be to admit the government's energy policy was fatal. Lloyd initially downplayed the severity, suggesting it was simply a particularly bad winter fog, indistinguishable from the ones London had survived for centuries. He resisted calls for an inquiry. The government line was simple: this is weather, not negligence. But the pressure was building. Labour MPs began to ask difficult questions in the House of Commons. They demanded to know why the government was prioritizing coal exports over British lives. Finally, on Tuesday, December 9th, the weather broke. A wind rose from the west. The temperature inversion lifted. The lid was removed from the bowl, and the toxic cloud began to drift out towards the North Sea. It left behind a black city. London was coated in a sticky, greasy grime. Curtains were ruined, walls were black. But the government tried to hide the bodies behind a statistic. Officials, including those in the Ministry of Health, initially attributed the massive spike in death certificates to an influenza epidemic. It was a convenient cover, but there was no flu. The Registrar General's number told the truth. In the week of the smog, deaths in Greater London were three times the normal rate. The initial government estimate was 4,000 dead. However, the dying didn't stop when the wind returned. Thousands more died in the following months from complications triggered by the week in December. Modern epidemiological studies now place the death toll at 12,000 people. The sheer scale of the death toll made the government's position untenable. The sight of the coffins broke the political resistance. Under immense public pressure, the Beaver Committee was formed to investigate the disaster. Its findings were a direct indictment of the burning of coal. This led directly to the Clean Air Act of 1956, championed by a reluctant government that had finally been forced to act. It was the world's first comprehensive air pollution law. Geoffrey Lord's nutty slag was slowly phased out. The open coal fire, the art of the British home, began to disappear. The Great Smog was the event that severed the link between British identity and the coal fire. It was the moment the sky fell on London, and in the silence of the aftermath, the modern environmental movement began to breathe.